This is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to be taking a look at maps, the assets, and how to assign lighting to them. So what you really have to know ahead of time is that you either need to have something already painted on the map that represents a fire or some sort of light source, or you're going to need an asset from your collection of files to use with the Fantasy Grounds map tools. So we're going to first get into the basics here. So when you're using a map in Fantasy Grounds, you want to make sure it has a grid on it. Most of the content that you get from the Fantasy Grounds store or from the Forge already has grids put on it for you. But if that's not the case, you want to come over here to the right-hand side on grid on the pane on the right-hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and put my pointer on because I want you to be able to see what I'm clicking on and what I'm pointing to. So up here on the top right corner, I unlock the map. This map doesn't have any line of sight or anything assigned to it, so I'm going to do that now. It's fairly simple, so it shouldn't take very long. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put a grid on it. So it's kind of already there, but it's invisible. So I'm going to turn this on, and you can see it lines up here in the corners, and it looks scaled pretty well for the actual map at hand. So it looks pretty good. And then if you want to use lighting or any sort of source like that, you're going to have to turn it on. So enable to see the lighting and any type of effects that you have when you want to put lighting and fires and stuff like that on the map, you need to turn on the lighting tool. And you see it's really dark because I haven't assigned any type of lighting. And then over here is the line of sight. So if you turn that on with your players with no players on the map, it's going to look very dark. So what I want to do first is go to the lighting tool, and over on the far right, if this is an outdoor map, which most of this is, I'm going to go ahead and assign a preset. So this will be moonlight. So it does kind of light it up a little bit more because it has the lighting preset of moonlight, which will cast a little bit of light as if you were outside when the moon's out. So the next thing I'm going to do is unlock the map if possible. And then I'm going to also change the color of the grid because it looks a little bit grayed out. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this yellow. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I actually clicked on the map. I didn't want to do that. Okay, so what I want to do is click on the grid and then the color picker and go with yellow. So that way you can kind of see a little bit better. And then I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, take a look, looks pretty good. And now I'm going to put a little bit of line of sight on these towers here because these are actually walls, but I might just make them terrain tools since you can potentially climb these. So I'll just go to the line of sight, and I'm going to use terrain on these. And I'll just use the line tool, and I'm just going to click around the very edges. And if you want to make a straight line, you can hold the shift key, and that'll keep you from having to try to make this perfectly straight if you want. This will help with that. And the only reason I'm showing this because it actually is helpful to have this in place. Sometimes you won't, so I'm just kind of showing you a little bit of steps before we start putting the assets down, because without all that stuff, this stuff doesn't matter. So we want to know some of the preliminary things before you actually start placing the assets. I know some of you already know this stuff, but there are others who watch these videos that don't. So it's important to cover this kind of stuff occasionally because it can be very frustrating if you have no frame of reference when it comes to building these assets. So that's why I'm taking a little extra time to do this. So hit shift on that and double click there. Okay, so, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. There we go. All right, So this is just a real basic preliminary line of sight type thing. Nothing big. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start pushing some kind of asset. So the easiest way to assign lighting to any sort of map or source is to just click on the lighting tool up here. And then if you have the light or add light tool here, then you click that. And then what you'll do is you'll pick a preset. So these are probably like torches. So I'll grab torch. And when I have that selected, I'm just going to click on these little torch light areas. And as you can see, this is lining up and lighting the map up. So that's how you handle that. So if you're going to add torches or a static image that like a fireplace, you just use the lighting tool, pick your preset, and then click where you want it to go. Now, if you want to move it, you want to go back to the selection tool, which is this arrow, and then click on whatever it is that you're trying to move and move it. If you try to place it and then move it all in the same motion, it'll end up making another one. So you want to make sure you're selecting the correct one. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is on this thing here, this is a wall. So I'm going to use glass on that because I don't really need a terrain because they can actually climb over that wall. And I don't necessarily want to block the vision on it. So I'm going to add glass to these walls here so that it just kind of corrals the adventurers into certain areas. And it doesn't allow them to walk through the wall. So what I'm going to do is go back to the line of sight tool. And then I'm going to take and put the line of sight on there with the window tool. So all I'm going to be doing is just kind of taking the line tool, using the window tool, and just kind of coming along this border here. And that way, if the players come onto the map, they're not going to just go through the wall. It's like an embankment. So I'll have this there, and if they want to climb it, I can just toggle it so they can climb the end of it. So there we go. So that's just the wall there, like a retaining wall, and then there's the actual towers. And now let's say you want to build a campfire, or you want to use an asset that actually just needs, like if you want an actual torch that you can move around. So this is where things get a little bit confusing if you're not used to the map tool. So you have assets, and especially if you have the Fantasy Grounds art subscription. So if I go to assets and you come over here and let's go to assets. And what we're going to do is we're going to check images will be anything that you can place on the map that is not interactive with the player. So if you place it on here, the players won't be able to move it. It'll be kind of a static image. So let's do something like, let's do a fire pit, because I think someone was asking about that online. So what I'm going to do is look, I have some assets on here that I purchased. So that's going to be in an image file, not a token. So I'm going to take the image file and I'm going to look for fire pit or fire pit and take a look. Oh, I misspelled it. That didn't help. Yeah, you have to spell it right. Otherwise, it's not going to come up. Okay, so here are some fire pits that I have in my assets folder. I don't really see anything I like here, so let me try campfire. That might be a better search term. There we go. So here's a campfire. There's no fire in it, but it's definitely a fire pit. So I'm going to drag that down to the hotkeys. I'm not putting it on the map yet. I want to get everything down here first to make it easier to build that when I need to. Because I don't want to keep opening and closing and using this window every 5 seconds. So I want to get most of the stuff I need right now. And then I'm going to look for let's look for fire itself. So I want to look for some fire, and we'll see if we get anything. So yeah, so here's some fire. We can use this stuff here. A lot of these are spell tokens, but we can use them as a fire if we wanted to. So here's a bonfire, so that'll work. So I'll put this down and drag that down to the hotkeys. So you can drag all of your stuff beforehand before you start, building anything. And then up here for a token, I'm going to actually look for a torch, and this is an actual token. So this is something players will be able to interact with. So I'm going to look, there's token, and then after I wanted to put in torch, not token. But I'm going to search for torch in a sec here. Now that's going to bring up every single token I have in the library, unfortunately. But what you want to do is do all your searching first and put everything down in your hotkeys when you're building maps, or most of the stuff anyways. That way you're not having to keep opening and closing this window and keep doing that. That's what ends up taking a lot of time, is you'll burn a lot of time, keep opening and closing the asset window. And every time you need something, you're over here looking for it, and then you close it, and then you go back and look for it again. You know, that takes too long. If it's just one item, that's fine. But if you want to make something like I'm making a bonfire and the campfire kind of layered together, so instead of trying to create this with one little piece at a time, I'm actually going through and grabbing all the components first. That way I'm not having to search for this stuff in the middle of creating the map, because then you're switching between windows and such, and that can be annoying. So it's just a way to help keep down the amount of clicking and opening windows and stuff. So you're going to grab a collection of whatever pieces you need for your assets that you want to put on the map. I mean, you're not going to be able to do all of them, but if you're building a dungeon, you want the walls, the floors, you know, the doors and such. Then when you're done with that, if you're going to build something else like a well, maybe you're going to want the well itself or a rounded structure, some water graphics, you know, that kind of thing. That way you're not, you know, constantly shifted around trying to figure out, you know, what you're going to get. So I'm going to go ahead and search for torch. And this is different than a regular asset, because a torch asset actually is just what it is. It's just the torch. So I'm going to have this representing a torch that's either being thrown or handed to someone else. So that's different. This is a token. If it was in the images folder, so I'll go to torch, see what that shows. It's actually a different asset. It's treated differently. So I have the same exact asset, but if you try to put it try to put it on the map, the players cannot interact with that. You have to place a token on the map for players to be able to interact with it. And I'll show you the difference here shortly. So I want to go ahead and close the assets window. Now I got all the stuff I want. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and start building the fire pit. So I want the fire pit to be roughly, you know, maybe about 20, not the whole thing, but I want it in the center here. So what I'm going to do is take this bonfire and go over to this layers tab up here on top, and make sure that I have a different thing selected, because I don't want to place the assets together on the same layer with the map. I'm actually going to have it form a different layer. So what I'm going to do is take this bonfire, put it up here in the tile area. So I'm going to left click and drag the bonfire that I looked for earlier and drag it up here. And it tells you it's 1.5 squares roughly when you place it. So I'm going to set it here on this edge here, and it'll be right at the vertex here. So I'm going to click that. And if you wanted to rotate it or recolor it or whatever, you could do that now before you even place it. Or if you want to flip it, or, you know, make it a 90 degree or whatever, it's easier to do it from here than trying to do it after you place it. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on the map. And as you can see, the bonfire has created its own layer, and that's what you want. So now I'm going to take the campfire asset and do the same thing. So I'm just going to left click and drag it. I'm going to click it on to this same level here, and it's going to be part of this asset. So click there, and there's the bonfire and the fire itself. So I want to make the fire pit a little bigger. So I'm going to go ahead and click the selection tool, which is important, because if you try to do it while you're in stamp tool, it's going to make another one. And then if you hold down the shift key or the alt key, it will scale so it won't stretch funny. And then if you can tell, they're on different layers. So this is covering the fire. So I want to actually take the fire and drag it up, which will go above this campfire, the bonfire. And then I'm going to actually stretch this by holding shift, and then I'm going to grab the corner here and kind of move it down. So that way it kind of fits in the pocket there. So that's just the fire pit. And then I'm going to create a folder, and I call this bonfire or something like that. just so I have an organizational folder. And then I'm going to drag those two assets into this folder. And as you see, I accidentally changed the order again. Here we go. All right, so now that we have those together, when you move this asset, when you're in the layer selection tool, you can move the whole thing together. So if I select this folder, you can move this whole thing as one unit instead of one piece at a time. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a light to this actual campfire. So another tool that you can use instead of just using the static ones like the torch and that sort of thing is you can make something called bonfire. It might be a little bit different in how it handles light. So what I can do is come up here to the options, and I can go to token lights. And what this will do is allow me to create my own token lighting if I want to. So this is torch, spells, that sort of thing. So if I wanted campfire, I could add my own and make that a preset, and it will show up in the actual options under the effects. So instead of just having these 6, it would create a campfire one if you wanted to. So that would be a custom one if you're going to do that. So what I'll do is I'll create a custom one. So here's the generic. There's nothing here yet. And if you want to look at torch to kind of give an idea of what it's set up like, you can do that. This is kind of on a really light yellow color, so I want to make this a little bit more orangey kind of color, like a kind of an orangish color. A little bit lighter than that though, because I don't want it to be too orange. And then, of course, we'll turn it down a little bit. Okay, so we assigned a color, and we want the bright radius, the lighting, to be a little greater than that. So we're going to go with 25 instead of 20. And then the fall off is going to be 30. And then for the dimness, we're going to go ahead and make this 50. So there's a little room for the dimness, and then 60 for the fall off for the dim part. So that's basically it. Now for the animation, we're still going to do flicker. And then for the speed, like how fast it's going to flash or flicker, this is at 25. I'm going to go with 20. So the flicker is going to be a little bit less than it would for the, for that. And then for duration, I think a campfire can potentially last longer than a torch, depending on how it's set up. But I'm effectively going to just double the time on it for a couple hours instead of 1 hour. So I'm going to go with 1200, but you could put whatever you feel like, whatever you think makes sense. And then for the effect tag, I'm just going to call it campfire, but it's one word, no capital. So campfire, and then up here, I'm going to call it campfire. And you can use this once it's done, once you save it, you can use it in your preset. So here's the campfire with all the effects and the details on it. And I just made it a little bit larger than a torch. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, close this, and as you can see now, for this, you have this token lighting, in which you could technically drag this and put it on, not this part, I didn't mean to do it like that, but if I go to let me close this. If I come back and I reopen this effects area, there's my campfire. I can drag this on to a token if I wanted to. But this case, I don't need to, because this is actually, I'm going to have that built into the assets, because this is something that players cannot interact with. So I got to use that on an actual token, not an asset on the map. But I wanted to just show you how to make a preset lighting effect. So if you wanted to make your own spell effects, like for fairy fire or something like that, you could. So now what I'm going to do is on the actual on here on the line of sight and all that, I'm going to actually assign a light to this layer where the bonfire is. So this is the way that you would do it for an asset as opposed to a token. So I'm going to go to the lighting tool, and right now it's set up and it has your preset, like I said before. There's none right now. You could pick any of these. I don't have campfire in here, but I can modify something and make it my own by adjusting these ranges. So I could do something like that, and I can also change the color. So I think I'm going to change the color to look a little bit more of an orangish color like I had in the previous example. And then I was just going to increase these by 5 feet. So 25, and we'll go with 30, and we'll go with 50 and 60. So this is going to be like basically what I was doing with the effect. So now that I've changed that, that's going to make the radius a little bit bigger. And the flicker speed, I'm going to turn that down to 20 for campfire. And then you'll click on your target. In this case, it's selected on the bonfire. So that's basically the fire itself. So now that lighting is assigned to that fire. The nice thing about this is once you're playing and such, when you're the GM, you can actually move this entire thing as a unit. So I want to make sure I'm on the selection tool in play mode, and then I can move this whole asset. So let me go back to, let me lock this. Here's play mode, and if I have this folder selected and I'm in the actual editing mode for the layers, I can move this whole thing instead of just one at a time. So I can move the whole fire over somewhere else. Maybe you want to move it up here. So this is a way that you kind of save it as a group, and then you can kind of group it together. And it kind of helps you with that. So that's one way to do this. The other thing is, what I was saying is the tokens, if you want to make those an asset that you can move and that players can interact with, it has to be a token. So it cannot be an asset like I have here. It actually has to be a token. So if I'm going to close the map, and down below I've already made a shortcut to the token asset. So if I drag this on the map, it's available. Players can see it. It can be moved, but I need to assign light to it. So what I'm going to do is go back to lighting. You go to token lights, which is this little icon here. I'm going to go to a preset, which is torch, and you got to make sure that you're going to add the light to the torch. So I have it selected. You have the token selected, you click add light, and that will assign lighting to that token. So now if a player comes up and moves this, the lighting and the token will move with the player. So this would be a good way to handle a spell token for, let's say, some of the things like Spiritual Hammer. Maybe you'll have a 5-foot radius light on it. You can do things like that with spell tokens, like ones that you control or that you can move. So there's a difference between assigning light to a token and assigning lighting to an asset that's built into the map. So this one here, the players can't interact with. This one here is an actual token. And the difference is when you're in your assets folder, anything that you want to have interactive or moving around with your players, you want them to be able to move it. You want to have that set up not as an asset. If you're over here in the images and you try to drag a torch onto the map from here, it's not going to be accessible for the player. So if I drag this on the map, it's now a part of the map. It's not a token. It's just a layer on the map. So that's the difference on that. So if you ever try to assign lighting, it has to be assigned to a token. So when you're doing spell tokens, for instance, and you want to use them on a map, they need to be in your tokens folder in Fantasy Grounds, not the assets, because those will be baked into the map, whereas the tokens will be accessible if you put them on the map for the players to use. And then they can move that token. And to make this easier instead of harder, you can load an extension that gives players a little bit more use of tokens. So if you have a player on the combat tracker and you use a plugin like Friend Zone, it'll make it easier for them to interact with these tokens. Otherwise, you're going to have to move them, and you might have to turn on token vision and lighting. So in here, in the options, there is an option called token vision and movement. So what that means is that players can see the token and they can move it, and they'll all be able to see with that token or through that token. So that's the only bad part about using this option, is it's usually either all or none. If you want it to be assigned to a specific individual, the way to do it is to use friend zone and then add the token or like an NPC to the player, and then use that and move that around too. So there's a couple ways you can do it. But doing it like this with an asset is not going to do anything. All that does is add another layer to the object here. It doesn't do anything. I mean, you can assign a light to it as a GM, but it won't move unless you move it yourself. So that's a whole different thing. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the layers tool and make sure I'm in the layer selection tool. Click on the asset and hit delete. And that's how you can access that. If you don't use the layer tool and you're trying to click on stuff on the map, it can get really confusing. So make sure you're in the layers and that you have the selection tool, the layer selection. Otherwise, you're going to be clicking on stuff and wondering why it's not working. You can't interact with NPC or player tokens when you're in edit mode or when you're making a map. You have to be in play mode. Once you're in play mode, then you can move these things around. So that's just a quick kind of tutorial. I don't know how quick it was, but at least you have an idea of the different types of lighting. So you can assign just a token light to a static image. You can assign a token light or a asset light to something like this bonfire and put it in a collection. And what's nice about this is I can turn it off. So if someone puts the fire out, I can actually turn off this lighting and I can turn off the bonfire flame. So it looks like this is not active. And then when they actually light a fire for the evening, you can turn those on for them and it will light up. So it kind of gives it a little bit more. Or you can just take this whole thing and hide it, like they did, like they got rid of the fire. And if you wanted to save this, you could just leave it there and just hide it until you need it. So there's no way to save that as a collection yet. I wish you can drag this folder into the hotkeys and save it for a different map, but that's not possible.